Dr. Fatima Denton, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really apologetic that I'm not there with you in person. Unfortunately, there were certain commitments that I could not get out of, and given the distance to travel to Marrakesh, I just couldn't fit in this very pleasant commitment. I also want to mention that I always enjoy going to Marrakesh and to all parts of Morocco, and I hope all of you there are enjoying yourselves and would get the most out of your stay. I'd like to talk to you about some findings from the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, which may have a bearing on the discussions that you're carrying out as part of this very important conference. Let me just tell you some of the major findings that we have come up with that apply to Africa. Well, firstly, let me say Africa as a continent is very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both on account of the nature and intensity of these impacts, but also because there is a level of poverty, there is a lack of infrastructure, all of which makes a large number of communities in Africa very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I'd like to mention a few other facts that would be of some interest to you. And let me look at some major findings from the fifth assessment report. One of the findings that we have come up with relates to the fact that climate change can lead to increased conflict. This does not mean that climate change by itself would be a determinant of greater conflict, but essentially it would be a force that exacerbates some of the existing conditions that are actually causing conflict or may have the potential for causing conflict. So that again is something that we necessarily have to avoid, and adaptation measures would have to ensure that the conditions that bring about conflict can be minimized. What are some of the conditions that could lead to conflict? Well, scarcity and stress as far as water is concerned is one such factor. A decline in agricultural yields, particularly where you have rain-fed agriculture, would be another condition. And the spread of disease, which also is consequent on climate change, could be another factor. Another major finding that we came up with was the possibility of greater conflict in several parts of the world, and there again Africa is one such location. I want to mention that climate change by itself may not be the driver of conflict, but clearly it could exacerbate some of the conditions which are leading to conflict already or have the potential for creating conflict. Again, we would have to ensure that we adapt to the impacts of climate change in such a way that we minimize the possibility of conflict arising as a result. Another major observation that we had is that warming is taking place across Africa. As a matter of fact, over the last 50 to 100 years, there's been a significant increase in temperature over most parts of Africa. So that again is an indicator of the fact that perhaps warming and climate change are taking place in Africa far more than several other regions of the world. This is also true of other tropical and subtropical regions on other continents as well. As a result of climate change, there are some ecosystems that are being affected more than others. There is evidence of warming leading to impacts on ecosystems in Africa, and as a result there are some species which are actually migrating to those locations where changes in climate are more suitable than where these species existed earlier. Now that has some major implications for biodiversity and its protection. It would also have major implications for wildlife, and since Africa is an important destination for tourism, there would be some changes that might take place in those locations where tourism existed in large numbers earlier, but is not going to be the case in the future. One major resource that's going to be affected is water. There are already locations in Africa where people are suffering from water stress, and climate change would only multiply some of the problems associated with water scarcity. So, here again adaptation measures would be extremely important. What are some of the adaptation measures that could be adopted? Well, better storage facilities, and in some cases possibly even changes in agricultural practices, since agriculture is by far the largest user of water among most economic sectors that you have in different parts of the world. Overall, there will be issues of food security in Africa, and these would result from a number of factors. Firstly, there is a tendency for yields to reduce as a result of the impacts of climate change. This combined with growing water scarcity and also increase in diseases as far as, let's say, livestock. Africa is also likely to face major problems in terms of food security. These would result from the impacts of climate change, which bring about a reduction in yields of agricultural crops, but also as a result of water scarcity and the spread of pests and diseases both for crops as well as livestock. There would be a decline in availability of food and a lowering of nutrition, which already is a serious problem in several parts of Africa. We must also remember that a number of farmers in Africa are not necessarily supplying their produce to the market. A number of them, particularly small farmers and those on rain-fed agriculture, are the ones. We must remember that in Africa, a large number of farmers are essentially dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and that as a result can also lead to problems simply because a large number of farmers, particularly those who have small holdings, are the ones who are producing enough food just for the consumption of their own households, and they are not really producing any significant quantities for sale in the market. And as a result of some of these factors which lead to decline of agricultural yields as a result of climate change, there would be a lowering of the amount of production that farmers are able to achieve, and that in turn would impact unfavorably on nutritional levels and can lead to a larger incidence of hunger. If one was to look at what actions are required to deal with the challenge of climate change, then clearly adaptation measures are going to be crucially important for Africa, and these apply as much to management of water, agricultural practices, as well as countering the negative impacts of climate change on human health. But I also want to emphasize that while these adaptation measures are absolutely essential, simply because even if we were to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases substantially at the global level, climate change will continue for several decades, and therefore we would have no choice but to adapt to some of these impacts. However, we must also remember that beyond a certain point, adaptation would become extremely challenging, because there are thresholds, there are tipping points beyond which the impacts of climate change would grow so serious that they would be beyond any realistic form of adaptation. So, while of course at the local level we will have to put in place some of these adaptation measures, globally it is absolutely essential for the world to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases if we want to deal with the overall challenge of climate change. Now, in this respect, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change very clearly lays down common but differentiated responsibility, and therefore we would have to keep in mind the fact that the problem of climate change has been caused not by the continent of Africa, but essentially by the developed countries of the world. But Africa is clearly very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And given the fact that this is a common though differentiated responsibility, every country will have to take steps to limit the increase in emissions of greenhouse gases. This, may I say, would also be important for local and domestic reasons, because after all, it's now become very clear that the pattern of development pursued by the countries of the West and those nations which are currently regarded as developed cannot possibly be emulated in the developing countries. Why is that so? Well, because if we were to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases, there are also substantial co-benefits for the countries that are adopting this kind of a measure. And these co-benefits would include higher levels of energy security worldwide, lower levels of pollution at the local level, possibilities of much greater employment, increase in agricultural yields and productivity. And therefore, for these very reasons, it's very important for Africa to adopt a model of development which brings about greater efficiency of use of resources of various kinds. And those resources include energy, water, and several other inputs that are required, such as ecosystem services, because in the process of utilizing certain ecosystems for human activities, there is the possibility of degradation. And hence, if we were to reduce the burden on some of these ecosystems, then that would allow much better conservation of those ecosystems and natural resources. So, in substance, may I say that globally, we would have to pursue a twin effort with regard to adaptation to the impacts of climate change as well as mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases. How this is shared in the case of mitigation is something that is being discussed under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in the case of adaptation measures, I think the responsibility falls largely on local communities to create the institutions, to create the policies and the capacity by which we can deal with the impacts of climate change. However, it's not as though resources for these can be generated locally, because particularly in poor societies, there is a limit to how much can be set aside by way of resources for adaptation measures. And therefore, there is also, of course, a responsibility for the global community to cooperate and to help those societies which lack the means. Overall, nevertheless, I think the time has come, if we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, for all the nations of the world and particularly the developed nations to be able to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. This is where I think Africa has an opportunity as well. Most African nations are at an early stage of development, and therefore the choice that they face is either to pursue the same path that was established by the developed nations, or to find something absolutely different, which certainly promotes growth and development, but does so in a manner that is far more resource efficient than has been the case with the developed nations. So, I would like to wish you all the best, and I am sorry I am not there in person, but I hope some of these broad findings from the 5th assessment report, which I have tried to paraphrase in my own words, will be of some value and will help you to guide your discussions during the course of this conference. Thank you very much.